Welcome everyone, welcome to the Joseph Movement's Table Talk. And today I would like to welcome my co-hosts. This is Ilse to my left, and she's a very popular Christian voice and face, and especially a very popular voice on Cape Radio pulpits. And then here to my right is one of the directors and team members of the Joseph Movement. And we just want to welcome you for joining us. Thank you so much. And we really want all of you watching this to enjoy this talk. And we believe that you will learn so much through this. And welcome to our guest. Welcome, Advocate Liechen. We just want to thank you so much for your time, Liechen. And just a very quick introduction. So Liechen is obviously an advocate. She runs a business by the name of Liberation Legal Consulting. So Liechen, my first question to you is, please tell us more about your business and how did you get started?
Good afternoon, everyone. To Tasha and the team, thank you so much for having me today, and for all the viewers joining us today, welcome and thank you so much for joining in. So Liberation Legal Consulting is something that started in around 2019, but it actually started before that already. While I was busy with my law degree, God put it into, on my heart that He didn't want me practicing as a normal advocate or attorney. And towards the end of 2019, He started to place it on my heart where He wants me to go. And that was to start Liberation Legal Consulting. So that's where all of this started, is to help others and to create awareness and to walk a journey with businesses and employees so that we can aim towards eradicating forced and bonded labor and labor trafficking within all the business sectors of South Africa. So what Liberation Legal Consulting does is we assist businesses with responsible business practices. And this is done through training of employees in key management positions, training employees on their rights within the workplace and so forth, what modern slavery is as a whole, to equip them so that they know what their rights are, but also with the business, what they should be compliant with. We also conduct risk assessments on businesses to assess where their key risks are for modern slavery. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the business is committing modern slavery. It's just that there are potential risks. And then we assist them in implementing processes and policies to prevent and mitigate those risks as far as is reasonably practicable through implementing policies and so forth. Yes.
Wow. Wonderful. Wow, that was quite a mouthful. That is a mouthful. But you are clearly playing a major role in helping to just get the labor side of businesses in line, but also you are helping to combat human trafficking. And I really want to honor you and thank you for that.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Advocate, I want to ask you, what would you say is the difference between labor trafficking, forced labor, and debt bondage?
Okay, so that is a very good question, because quite often the differences between labor trafficking and forced labor, those two concepts are quite often seen as synonymous, or being synonymous. But if we look at our South African legislation that deals with this topic, that is the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act. So that legislation provides us with the definitions on that. So labor trafficking would be where a person is trafficked with the purpose of that being for labor services. So there we look at the definition that has 3 elements to that definition, being the act, the means, and the purpose. With the act being recruitment, transport, harbor, exchange, lease, or receive, for instance. The next element is means. This is how it is done, through the threat of harm or force, coercion, abuse of power or abuse of vulnerability, and even giving or receiving of payments or benefits. And then with the last element being the purpose, that is the why all of this is happening. And that is the form of exploitation. And in labor trafficking, that will then be for labor purposes. So when we then look at forced labor also, the ultimate purpose is for labor because the labor is forced. But if we look at the definition in terms of legislation, the definitional elements differ to that of trafficking, in that forced labor is where labor or services are obtained or maintained without the person's consent by using threats or perceived threats of harm, force or intimidation, or other forms of coercion or physical restraint to that person or another person. So we can see that just between those two, the definitional elements are different. So that's where a major difference comes in. And then with debt bondage, we often also refer to it as bonded labor. So here we also look at the definitional elements created in legislation, where it's any conduct that or any conduct that does amount to debt bondage is criminalized in our legislation. So debt bondage is where it's an involuntary status or condition where personal services or the personal services of another person under this person's control, who this debt is owed to, are promised as security for either a claimed or a perceived debt. So the debt might actually be a legitimate debt, or it can be a perceived debt in that, let's say in a scenario where there is an employment relationship, where if the employee maybe does, the employer perceives that the employee had done something wrong and then fines that employee. So that's not in line with labor legislation, for instance, because not the correct processes were followed, but the employee is fined, and that starts to create the debt. And that employee is then required to have to work that back. And another important factor around debt bondage or bonded labor is where if the actual or the claimed or debt is then measured, so through a reasonable assessment, so the amount that the debt amounts to, and the length or nature of services that needs to be worked back or to pay back the debt is excessive when measured against each other. So, for instance, expecting an employee to work back a debt of, let's say, 5,000 Rand over a 10-year period or even a 5-year period, that is quite excessive. And if that employee wanted to leave employment, instead of that debt having been worked back and actually deducted from the principal amount, that hasn't been done. So then if the employee wanted to leave, they have to pay back the full amount. So if we perhaps use a scenario where, because this is a practice quite often used within the business space, where an employer would pay for training for an employee, and then an agreement is reached and the employee needs to work that amount back over, let's say, a year period. That is fine and acceptable. But let's say at the 11 months into that agreement, the employee wants to leave employment. So then the outstanding amount should have already decreased to only have one month's payment left. But then the employer requires the full amount to be paid back. So it's instances like that that we look at when it comes to debt bondage.
Yeah, I just actually want to add to that, because one also finds a lot of debt bondage within the more disadvantaged communities. Is that not so? Where, for instance, a child has inherited the debt of a family member, and it just keeps rolling over and rolling over throughout generations, and it's such an unrealistic debt that they don't get to a point where it's paid off.
I can never walk in freedom.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure. Definitely. In other countries, I've read of cases where exactly that happened, where that debt has become a generational debt, and then the initial debt is something as small as being less than 50 Rand. If we equate that to our South African currency. And so there we can see the period in which it needs to be worked back is excessive in relation to what the principal debt is. And it is extremely sad. Even in the business space, if it is something as silly as just a payment at, or a salary advance that ends up being exploited. I remember during COVID, quite a number of attorneys reached out to me with concerns where employees had approached them because the employers said this was during our initial stage 5 or level 5 lockdown, where the employers would say, okay, so I'm going to pay you your full salary at the end of this month, but part of that salary would be made up by the TERS payment that government had made available to employees, and then the remaining amount would be regarded as a loan that the employee had to work back. And there already we see that there is a major risk, because how is that employee going to work that amount back? Because they are already providing their services to the employer. Are they then expected to have to work overtime? Does that overtime requirement start to become excessive working hours that are expected of the employee to work that amount back? So that's where this whole discussion, also starts to become prevalent in our day-to-day life. It's not something that used to happen way back, or in history, or that's only happening in other countries. It's happening in South Africa today.
Yes. I must be honest with you, I am grasping slowly but surely the difference between forced labor and labor trafficking. But I think for people who are actually not working in that arena, it is difficult to grasp. You actually have to go sit down and look at the definitions properly and study them to understand the difference. But it's interesting that we need to at least know that there is a difference. Yeah.
Sure.
You wanted to ask another
question?
I
want to ask you, some of the listeners might have children in school at the moment. What would you say must high school children look out for in order to keep themselves safe at this stage?
Okay, so here the role of parents is also important. Have an open line of communication with your children. Equip them from a young age, or a high school age, young age compared to me, but what their human rights are, what their labor rights are, so that they know when the day comes that I need to enter the working space, these are the aspects that I should be expecting. These are the obligations of the employer towards me as an employee. We have previously had discussions where potentially within schools, as part of curriculum or so, that these topics can also be discussed with children to assist in equipping them. But also, for children wider than just the labor space, is again touching on having that open line of communication with our children, so that if there is ever a situation where they do not feel safe, or a person who they do not feel safe with, that they know they can come to the parents or any adult that they trust and can share that with them. We've got wonderful organizations in the field, such as Protective Behaviors, who do training on this in schools and with parents as well, that specifically it's not related to the workspace and high school learners moving into that space, but equipping children to know if something doesn't feel right, they have a voice to say, no, I am not comfortable with this. But yes, I mean, if let's say a high school learner wants to go for vacation work, if there is a job opportunity offered to them, do your research beforehand, and this is also applicable to anyone entering the job space. Do your research beforehand. Google if there is a website of this particular company. If there is a website, have a look at the details, the contact details on the website. Does the phone number, for instance, differ than the phone number in the email signature of the person communicating with you? If so, phone the number on the website, reach out to the company, perhaps the HR department, or so, confirm, does this person work at the company? And is this opportunity a legitimate opportunity that is actually being offered by the company? If they go for an interview.
Yeah. And also, sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
If you do that, do your research. Don't just take everything at face value, because we know from those of us who work on the ground that there are so many job scams out there. And also for those watching this, remember, South Africa has a national human trafficking hotline.
Yes, very important.
Yes. And that hotline number is not just there to report suspicious behavior or situations, but they also have recently trained staff to also look into and investigate possible job scams, Liechen. So use that number. It's an easy number to remember. It's 0800 222 777. You give them all the details you have about the position, the number. Often, if it is a job scam, they would link that number to one that they already have in their database, and then you can make an informed decision. Yeah.
I also think for the viewers that is watching this program, for high school children, it's also very important for the parents and the children to have an open relationship with each other, because your home is your first ministry. It's where it starts. If you can have an open relationship with your child, then you will stop human trafficking firsthand. So that's very important, to have an open relationship.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think communication is very important as well, that the children must tell their parents where they are going, so they can know when they might be in danger or not.
Yes, for sure. For sure.
Yes. And I mean, Ilse, that is one of the things I also wanted to mention. I mean, if you go for an interview, don't don't feel silly for asking someone you trust, please track me. I'm going to send you a pin location via WhatsApp, for instance. I know Truecaller recently, in one of their updates, they made available a safety feature where you can track people. So you can add people to your group, or you can specifically, so if you go for an interview, for instance, you can specifically ask your group of numbers and trusted people who you have in your circle. If there's a feature there that you can ask, please look out for me. So then they know for the next hour you are at the interview, this is where the address that you are going to be. If you start to move to another address, but you haven't reached out to them yet, that, you know, they can perhaps just monitor it. If need be, they cannot get hold of you, for instance, or so, that they can get law enforcement involved if needed.
Definitely. And there's also that live pin feature on WhatsApp that one can use and share with a loved one or someone you trust. And then also the Namola app, which has, I think it has tracking in it, but I speak under correction, but it also has a panic button. So that's very important. So those are tools that one can use. And unfortunately, in today's day, we have to use it.
Sure. Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
It's sad, but we need to equip not only ourselves, but our loved ones as well. Children and adults alike, and even men. We need to even equip and educate men, because it is not only women or children that are at risk for this. It's our men as well. Yeah,
most definitely, I agree.
And Liechen, I just want to ask you this question. What are the human rights valuations that one should look out for in a workplace in order to determine whether you or someone else is being exploited?
Okay, so here with human rights, if we look at the Constitution, so the Constitution is our cornerstone of our democracy. And in chapter 2, it contains all the various human rights that are afforded to each and every one of us. So, and an important human right that is contained there is like equality. All of us have the right to equality. All of us have the right to fair labor. Children have the right to be protected. Freedom of trade, occupation, and profession. So all of those rights, you know, if we see, but wait, this situation is in some way violating that right, feel free to dig deeper, to ask questions if possible. But specific instances is where we see non-compliance in terms of labor legislation. So if we compare that to the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act, it's, if I can put it on a scale, on the one side, there would be decent work. And then as we move a little bit further down, that will be where labor violations come into play. So there it would be instances where there's just not compliance in terms of labor laws, not an employment contract in place, pay slips, minimum wage requirements aren't met, etc. But if
which is completely different from trafficking.
Yeah.
Yes. So there it's not yet a criminal matter. It's just a contravention of labor laws. But it's a short, slippery slope from there to moving what we are discussing today is modern slavery, trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, child labor. So there it becomes the criminal aspect where a person's human rights are violated. They don't have freedom of movement. They are isolated. There is physical or sexual violence present in the situation, intimidation, threats, coercion. retention of identity or travel documents. It's important for people to know that you are the only one who should be in possession of your original ID, passport, travel documents, visas, and so forth. An employer or anyone else cannot hold that. They cannot be in possession of that. They cannot, they can only have copies of that if provided by you. Withholding of wages, abusive working and living conditions, long working hours that aren't in line with labor legislation. So all of those are red flags to look out for, to see whether a person is potentially being exploited. And then from there, if you suspect it, report it. The number, Tertia, you mentioned earlier, the helpline, the 0800 222 777 number. Phone that number. Apologies, the call center is phenomenally trained. They are available 24/7. A person can even phone in anonymously to report something, and the helpline then works together with key stakeholders within that area. SAPs, the Hawks, provincial task teams, rapid response task teams, DSD, Department of Health, Employment and Labour, and so forth. And they will then investigate it further and then act on that.
Yes, thank you, Liechen. I just want to add to that to those who are watching, is these people who are working together with a hotline, most of them's hearts are in it. Sure. Because I hear so many, but why must I go to SAPs? Because they're not reliable and they're so corrupt. This is all these things that you constantly hear. But those people that Liechen just mentioned are people whose hearts are in the work. I mean, we're talking about the Hawks, and we know that there are even corrupt police officers that do not like the Hawks. And that is wonderful. It's encouraging because we know that we have these people in our country that actually do the work that's supposed to be done and do wonderful work. So I just wanted to add that.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, one bad apple doesn't make all apples in general bad. We do have people in government departments who do phenomenal work and who really are passionate and do go the extra mile in this. And I absolutely commend them for the work they do.
Most definitely, yes. Liechen, so I would like to ask you a question. When it comes to, war and conflict within other countries, what ripple effects have you seen and have you heard of when it comes to feeding modern day slavery and human trafficking? We think of the effects of the economy, we think of misplaced children, and that has serious ripple effects and it feeds into human trafficking. So what are these terrible effects that it has?
Even now, this war that's going on,
Exactly. Yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, Suzelle, as you mentioned, there is currently a war going on, and there, if I remember correctly, they were talking about around 1.5 million migrants that they were, or Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine that they were expecting. I mean, that's a massive number, but that definitely has an effect on trafficking, because there we talk about the vulnerability factor. Their vulnerability is increased. They're at a higher risk for that. I mean, they leave behind everything they know, they have to leave behind. So they're going to a new area. They don't know anyone there. They don't have work there, accommodation. They might not even have money with them. So their vulnerability is increased because, unfortunately, traffickers prey on that. So they will see, here's someone, let's say, for instance, a mother with children who had to flee her country, and she needs to look after herself and her children. So she will take any work she can get, even if it is in horrid circumstances. It's, even if she just gets something, she will do that. So that, unfortunately, it does happen. But, migrants don't just flee to one country. It's various countries that they flee to. And from there, they might potentially be moved to other countries again. So it is, if we just look at South Africa is a source, transit, and destination country. So for people, our South Africans are trafficked or exploited within South Africa. They might be moved to other countries to be exploited there. People are moved through South Africa from another country to their destination country to be exploited there. So for migrants where there is a war or conflict situation, and as you mentioned with the economy, all of that has a ripple effect. Even if they didn't flee the country, let's say, so this war or conflict is over, there's still a period that has to lapse for that country's economy to grow again back to what it was. It's not going to immediately be what it was again. So traffickers will also exploit that and go into that country and say, oh no, but I've got a wonderful working opportunity for you in my country, or I will take your children and look after them in my country, send them to school, that type of thing, and take the children and then exploit them. In 2019, if I remember correctly now, there was a situation like that where a lady said to a mom outside of South Africa, she will take her child, bring the child to her in South Africa so that the child can go to school and have a good life. Because everyone thinks South Africa is this honeypot, so to speak. And unfortunately, that 4-year-old was brought to South Africa and was forced to work in her home. He didn't go to school. He didn't have the life a child should be having. And 5 years later, this was only picked up. And luckily and thankfully, the child has been, had been removed out of that circumstance. And this lady who had exploited him is currently in jail.
No, that's good.
That's good news.
Yes.
Wonderful news. Sure, thank you for that.
And Liechen, I just would like to ask you, how did you know if labor trafficking or child trafficking is present within the supply chain of any product line? How will you know about it? Because we don't know.
No, definitely. It isn't something that a company or anyone is going to stand there with a billboard and says, oh, we've got child trafficking in our supply chain, for instance. But this is where, from consumer side, it comes in. I always like to say cost and worth. We might know what the actual cost was of a product or service, what we actually paid for that. But we need to ascertain by asking the difficult questions to brands that we support, to ascertain what processes do they have in place to prevent and mitigate this. Do they conduct due diligence on their supply chain? Whether it's tier 1 suppliers or further down their supply chain, perhaps to tier 2, tier 3, maybe even. So asking the difficult questions, because that's where the worth of that product or service comes in. Because let's say you might have paid 100 Rand for something. that was the cost. But the worth of that is actually so much more, because a person was exploited for that. So you're paying for a person's, slavery. So it then, we need to ask the questions. I know in another country, but that had been has been stopped, where they had a red list. So if businesses were found to have trafficking or any form of exploitation within their operations or so, their names were added to this red list. So you could go have a look on this list, and if that company's name was on there, you knew not to, for instance, make use of their services or buy their products. So that is one way of going, and completely not supporting a business or a brand. But then it begs the other question: if we completely stop supporting one particular brand, who are we actually helping? What is that ripple effect on its own? In that they then cannot, continue with business. So the people that are mostly affected by that decision is the employees. Because if they maybe were still receiving some form of salary, they might not be receiving it at all, because the employer is just going to say, but I can't pay you, so just continue working, I'll pay you when I can pay you. Rather, between businesses, if they pick up red flags in their supply chain through conducting due diligence and so forth, honest, with their suppliers, is walking a journey with them, having an open line of communication, and businesses being transparent between each other, not on business trade secrets or anything like that, but what their operations are like, what they are doing, what they're picking up, how they are preventing and mitigating that and helping that. And also, asking the question, if you pay, let's say the market-related price for a product or service is 200 Rand, but now you're paying 50 Rand for that. That immediately should be a red flag. How is that business able to sell that product or service at that amount? If we just look at domestic services, for instance, the new national minimum wage has been amended and in effect from the 1st of March this year, and is currently on 23 Rand, if I remember correctly, 23 Rand 19 cents. So if, there's a company that comes in and says, okay, we will come and clean your home for the day. We're going to send 3 ladies to come in for the cleaning service, but they charge you 200 Rand. You beg the question, they are working, let's say 3 ladies working for 6 hours, for instance, but you're paying 200 Rand.
Yeah, how much are they getting?
Yeah.
How much are they getting? Yes. So instances like that, ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions to the brands that we support.
Yeah. That's a very difficult one, because so much of what we use down the supply chain or the production line, there is form of exploitation there somewhere. I think of, coffee, gold, cotton, mica, which we find in beauty products, or more specifically in makeup.
Yeah.
And you even find mica in some electronic products, because it's such a good conductor of heat and electricity, like your fluorescent lights. For goodness sakes, it becomes so difficult. So one of the things I would say to people who ask me about it is, one way to really just play your part when it comes to this whole question is to also try and support local. because I do believe that local has far less exploitation in it. Although you can't deny that there might be exploitation, but I think it's far less. Yeah, so it is very much a difficult one.
It is.
Very.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Yes, definitely it is. I mean, we've got no straightforward, cut and dry answer to a question like this. It is extremely difficult. I know some businesses in South Africa, if you go onto their website, for instance, they will have a modern slavery policy or statement published there, even maybe a report that is published there. So that's where the company annually publishes a report or something to say, this is what we do within our operations to try and prevent and mitigate these risks as far as is reasonably practicable. And that is fantastic. I think the more businesses start to do this, the easier it would become for us as consumers to know which products have been responsibly sourced or manufactured or provided. But that is still something that is difficult. So that's why I just always say, you know, ask the questions. Don't be afraid to pop an email to that brand and ask, you know, what are you doing? Provide me with information. But still, that being said, keep an open mind. There at times might be something that is present, and then it comes out in time.
Thank you, Liechen. You want to ask a question?
Yes, I want to ask you, Liechen, the Slavery Footprint website. Please tell us about how we can personally find out about our own slavery footprints.
I love this question because the Slavery Footprint Survey is I absolutely love it because it's such an amazing awareness creating tool for us personally, because it really, really brings this topic home. So the Slavery Footprint Survey, you can just go onto Google and search it. It would pop up there. You go onto that survey. So what this survey does, it takes you about, I think, 10 minutes to complete. And then it asks you various questions. For instance, the size of your home, you know, the number of vehicles you've got, the number of electronic devices you've got, the number of denims in your cupboard, for instance, jewelry, makeup, in your grocery cabinet, you know, what type of produce do you have there, and in the fridge and freezer? How often do you eat fish in a week? That type of thing, because we've got certain products and sectors that do have a higher risk for modern slavery than others. But ultimately, through asking all of these various questions, what the survey does is it calculates the number of people potentially exploited for you as a consumer to enjoy the standard of living materially that you've got. When I completed that survey, I got the number 75. So that means for me to have what I've got, potentially 75 people were exploited for that. I mean, we're sitting in 2022. It is an extremely high number. And I work within the field. I am cognizant around any services that I would like to make use of. Before even agreeing to anything, I ask them, do you have contracts in place? Do you pay about minimum wage or above? Do your employees receive leave, sick leave, maternity leave? Are those afforded to them, for instance? And I got 75. So, you know, yeah, it just shows us how wide an issue this actually is. And it spans not only within one country, but it spans globally, because supply chains and value chains are a global network, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sorry, I know that Suzelle wanted to ask a question.
I say it's really an eye-opener, that website. I also went on it today to find out what it was. And okay. So the next question I would like to ask you is, which South African labour laws are being evaluated when a person is a victim of labour trafficking?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the Constitution of South Africa, that is our main one to look at. So anything that is done, any action, whether it's between private parties and government, or government departments or so, everything needs to be in line with the Constitution and the human rights afforded to us in terms of the Bill of Rights. So in terms of that, labor laws were ultimately created. So labor laws comply with the with the Constitution. Apologies. So the main one that often gets violated is the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, where instances of not providing an employee with an employment contract before they start employment, working hours, if the working hours aren't in line, regular working hours as well as overtime working hours. If they work overtime, how are they remunerated? Are they remunerated at 1.5 times or double the rate, whether it's a Sunday or a public holiday, for instance? Pay slips, if employees receive pay slips. Sure, what is another one that often comes up? Deductions on salaries. So an employer making unjustified deductions from an employee's salary. It's always important to note, before an employer can only deduct what he's legally allowed to deduct. That is like tax, UIF, those types of deductions, payee, and so forth. Anything else that is deducted, the employee needs to consent to that. An employer can't just deduct left and right. So yes, instances like that in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, Occupational Health and Safety Act as well, because Occupational Health and Safety Act aims to ensure a safe working environment for all employees. So if there is instances of labor exploitation happening within the workplace, most likely that business isn't going to be compliant with OSHA. So it's not going to be a safe working environment. PPE is not going to be provided to employees. And also important to note, an employee cannot be required to pay for their PPE. That needs to be provided by the employer, or a uniform. The employer needs to provide that to the employee. And then Children's Act, although it's not specifically a labor specific act, but the Children's Act also, and also together with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, have requirements where children are protected when they are allowed to work. So it sets out the requirements when is a minor allowed to be employed, and under what conditions can they be employed. So if the situation does not adhere to that, although child labor can be seen as child labor, it is a child providing labor, but then it moves to exploitative or worst forms of child labor. This is where, they are working in hazardous working conditions, physical hard labor that is provided, long working hours. It's work that isn't safe for that child to be doing, whether it's for their physical well-being, mental or emotional well-being, and so forth. So those are some of the laws that are violated if a person is suspected of being a victim of trafficking.
Yeah. I just, I know Cesar wants to ask another question, but I just want to interrupt you, girl. Sorry. Okay, so I just want to emphasize that what we're discussing today is trying to just identify the difference between labor trafficking, forced labor, and domestic servitude. Am I right? That is what we are trying to, or sorry, bonded labor.
Yes,
Did I get that right? Okay.
Yes.
So just for those who are watching, so we should never confuse some of what we're discussing now. And when you're in a position where there are ill labor practices, it does not necessarily mean that you are a victim of human trafficking.
Yeah.
So that's why we just want to encourage you. We want to like really whet your appetite through this discussion to go and to do your own research and to go and see what are your human rights as an employee. So that is also very important. And then I also just want to ask, apparently according to our legislation, children are allowed to be employed from the age of 16 with the condition that it's in line with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So the Basic Conditions of Employment Act does make provision for children to work from 16, or well, the year in which they turn 15 or are allowed to leave school. I always prefer to work it from 16 and over. That's always just the safest route to go. So then it sets out the requirements that need to be complied with should a child enter the workplace. So this goes both ways to equip what your rights should be for, you know, as a minor in the workplace, but also for the employer what their obligations are towards that minor being employed. So the work isn't allowed to be hazardous to their health, their physical or mental well-being, emotional well-being, and so forth. It can't be hard physical labor. You can't expect a child to do the same physical labor that you would expect from an adult. Working long hours. Importantly, it cannot interfere with their schooling. It cannot interfere with their schooling. That's the most important one. And also remunerate the children, but this is, you know, just my personal one, remunerate them according to what the remuneration laws are. Don't, just because it is a minor, let's say, have them work for the entire day, but just pay them 50 Rand. That for me is also exploitation.
Of course, yeah.
Yes. So as long as the situation, you know, is in line with those requirements, then it, you know, would be fitting. But yes, it's always good to rather, you know, err on the side of caution with this. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Liechen.
I don't have any other
Oh, are you done?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe I can just ask Liechen, is there anything that you would like to say to the viewers, specifically as we are ending this session?
Just to reiterate, same as what Tertia mentioned earlier as well, educate. You know, be aware of what the differences are, what the red flags are, and start to have discussions about this. You know, if you're, you know, if it is possible, and depending on what the situation is, but if you're at a gathering, for instance, you know, chat about this. You know, did you know I read XYZ this weekend? I didn't know this, but equip those within your circles on what it is, what to look out for, and what they can do. You know, report it to SAPS, report it to the helpline, for instance. Same as with businesses. If there's anyone within business listening today, have these discussions as part of your operational meetings in your business, because this topic ultimately interlinks within every space within your business operations. So, you know, start to make it part of your business culture. And if anyone sees something, then say something. Don't be afraid to report something. That it rather be investigated to make sure what the real situation is, and that if it, you know, is that situation, then key stakeholders can then be called upon to act.
For accountability.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you want to say or make a comment or ask another question, Ilse?
No, not at this stage. I think she answered all the questions that we had. Thank you so much.
Liechen, if people want to get hold of you for your services when it comes to, you know, being in line with labour law and all of that, and just asking advice, how can they get hold of you?
People are more than welcome to reach out to me via my business's Facebook page, Liberation Legal Consulting. All of my contact details are on there as well, but telephonically on 082 563 2402. So this would be then for any labor related assistance with regards to potential labor exploitation, or with businesses wanting to go through the journey to become compliant in this.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Liechen.
Thank you, Liechen.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you very much and the work you're doing. It's just so amazing to have individual professionals that are also, you know, fighting the cause with us NGOs. And we also appreciate you because we learn from you. So for that, we're very grateful and we want to commend you for that. Thank you so much. And I just want to tell those who are listening, please, you can get involved by making contact with the Joseph Movement. You can find us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram. You can even find us on LinkedIn. Please follow us, like us, and share the posts that we post on our social media platforms, because that is just such an easy way and simple way. You know, it's just a click and a click and a click. Exactly. And you don't know, it's immeasurable, but you don't know who's going to read that little bit of information, and you might actually stop someone from being trapped and, you know, exploited. So that's very important. And also, please remember the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And yes, it's a South African National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is 0800 222 777. You can also visit the Joseph Movement's website. We have there a page with some of our events and conferences, and you can contact us if you're at all interested. And if you want to support us in any way, obviously as a NPC, we are reliant on people who believe in our work to support us financially, but that is not the only way you can support us. You can support us by volunteering your time and your talents. And don't underestimate it. We can use you whether you are a designer, whether you are a web developer, whether you like working with children, whether you like public speaking, whether you like photography, absolutely anything. If you like art, if you like drawing. One thing that we're really looking forward to is we want to be able to one day design a beautiful, massive poster that children who can't read can just look at these little beautiful visual pictures and they can see all the various ways of how they can be exploited. So those are just some of the creative ways and how you can get involved. So please make contact with us. One way of also getting hold of the Joseph Movement is through our WhatsApp line, which is 082 766 9870. So please make contact and remember to follow us. And there's one thing we want you to also remember. You have to always do something. Hashtag do something.
Yes.
Okay, and that's a wrap.